Hey YouTube, Kiratwig here, bringing you all my Yu-Gi-Oh! 70,000 subscriber special. I wanted to do something different for the 70,000 subscriber special for the channel. I can't thank you all enough for sticking with me for this long on the channel. And with the 60,000 subscriber special, we did a video where I went over my top 10 favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks. So I figured for the 70,000 subscriber special, I wanted to do something similar, but still focus on the fact that this is a channel that focuses on deck profiles. So I figured I'd go over my least favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks. Now this was definitely a difficult decision to make because I do like a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks in the game. And who knows, my opinion on these decks may change with some future support. But just for the time being, these were decks that I ranked as, decks that I just never really enjoyed playing. When I had the decks, I could never, keep the decks. I would build them, and then I would just not be a fan of them after a good while. So that's where I kind of rank these decks. Either I just don't like the play style, I don't, like the concept of how the deck plays, and once again, there might just be some bad stigma behind the decks and why I don't enjoy them as a whole, whether it be the aesthetic of the deck, the art style, you name it. There are multiple reasons, but these are, once again, just my opinion, so don't let them, conflict on your own, ways for favorite decks. There are some decks, I'm sure, on my favorite deck video that others may find as they're not favorites, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Starting off at the number 10 spot, we have Ritual Beasts. Now, don't get me wrong, I love fusion plays, but I would say with Ritual Beasts, the big problem is just the overall play style of the banish aspect. I tried to get into Gladiator Beasts, but I still enjoy more the aesthetic of how the Gladiator Beasts look compared to the Ritual Beast aspect. To me, Ritual Beasts just stemmed too much from Gustos, which were a favorite of mine, and I just couldn't really get into the play style of the Ritual Beast deck compared to Gustos, and that will be another big trend on some of these decks. They share an aesthetic with some of my other decks that I do enjoy, but I just really didn't like about the decks themselves. And I really tried to like Ritual Beast when we got the newer support from the Terminal Revenge booster set, but the new support just wasn't really enough for me to really consider this as one of my favorites. And as I said, I really do enjoy a lot of different Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, whether it be with the aesthetic of the deck or the play style, and I just really wasn't there for Ritual Beast. There are just other decks that I enjoy the aesthetic and the play style more of what the deck is meant to do over this deck. Now for number 9, we have Ghost Tricks. Now, once again, I really struggled with this list, and I really do like the art style for Ghost Tricks, but it's just the play style of this deck for me that really doesn't do much for me as a whole for what the deck was meant to do. Focusing on the set playstyle is a fun premise altogether, but with the times I've tried to play Ghost Tricks, it just really didn't stick with me for what you were supposed to do. It feels like a very defensive style deck, and you really don't have a go-to playstyle that you can focus on with this deck as a whole. There are other fun decks that I've enjoyed with very similar aspects of the deck for that defensive playstyle. Sub-Terrors were one I really enjoyed, but once again, this is a deck that just overall for the play style I couldn't enjoy. I love the art on the majority of all the Ghost Trick monsters. I think it's a really cute archetype. It reminds me of Madolches in a lot of ways. But for my number 9 pick, and as we go on, the higher we go up the list, the more I actually dislike the deck. So for being at the bottom of the top 10 dislike Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that I have is one of the reasons why, just the overall play style. If we see some future sets that may change how Ghost Tricks play, then my opinion could change for this deck overall as well. And as you've noticed with my top 10 favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, I actually had decks for all of them. With the dislikes, I only actually have 2 of the decks of the 10 I am discussing today. So with that is why I just have these singles. I barely have any cards for the decks that I don't really enjoy. The 2 decks, which we'll go over when we get to them, are, specific reasons as to why I have these decks to begin with. So with the next one, our number 8 spot, and that deck for me is just the Monarchs as a whole. I really do like the Monarchs, how they look archetype-wise. I love the different attributes, having different versions of the different types of Monarchs, but I really am not big on the lockdown playstyle, which you'll see with a couple other decks on this list as well. I don't really like decks that limit their opponent's playstyle. Domain of the Monarchs is a big one there. Shutting down an extra deck to me really takes away from being able to let your opponent really see what they can do as a whole playstyle-wise, and that seems to be a big thing with Monarchs, whether it be the destruction playstyle, the tribute option, using your opponent's own resources, their Storm of the Monarch card, Domain of the Monarch card. I guess you could say their spell and trap lineup is the big reason why I dislike this archetype as a whole. They don't really focus on the extra deck at all, and with me and my playstyle, that is something I really do enjoy as a Yu-Gi-Oh player, being able to tap into the extra deck and summon out a bunch of different monsters during each playstyle. Monarchs just don't fit that role for me. Now, with the next spot, we have our number 7 spot. And for me to just find cards as a whole for Spirals for number 7 was another difficult challenge for me. Now, when Spirals first got their support for Double Helix, I really did give this deck a try, and I did enjoy some of the playstyles for it, but I guess what I would, least like about this deck is just the limitations we still have with it. I would love to have Master Plan back to fully try out the combos with all the other different Spiral cards, but just with that limitation, and for the fact that there's kind of a, just that lack of limitation for when I wanted to fully try this deck out, and just the overall play style of it had a chance for me to use it, but I just missed out on that spot. If that makes sense to you, I really would like to give this deck another try. It could completely be out of my top 10 least favorite Yu-Gi-Oh decks after, some support changes for this deck. But until then, I don't have Master Plan to use. We have to focus on a Magician's Soul lineup to make this deck viable. So that's why I decided to stick it at the number 7 spot, just because there is potential for this card to be removed from my top 10 list. And with that, we'll see some other plays. Now, one thing you also have to realize with my top 10 list, I decided to exclude any of the more recent decks because I feel like that would be more of a bias based on the current meta, and just focus on decks that have been around for a good while for this list. That's why there's not going to be any Tempai Dragons, anything like that on this list, just because I feel that's more of a recent current meta opinion on those decks. And I know that a lot of people dislike Tempais right now, but I just couldn't feel myself or justify the reason to put them on the list yet, since they're still more recent, more new to the current meta, and that wouldn't be fair to put decks like Ryzeal, Malice, Tempai, you name it, on this current list for when this video was released. So for our next spot, we have the number 6, and once again, we're going off of a restriction for game style, with this deck being the Masterpiece or the true Draco Slayer deck. Now, whenever I would go up against this deck, against locals, I just did not have a good time. When this deck was at full power, you really couldn't do much to get around this deck, with the focus being that you were just destroying all your opponent's cards by attributing out your own monsters using your spell and traps. We had Dragonic Diagram, which just made the cards all the stronger. It protected them from battle. Getting over this deck for what we had at the time was just all the more difficult. I really didn't like playing it. Masterpiece is still banned. I really don't want to see this card come back. I don't really think the deck would do much, but it really wouldn't change my opinion on why I dislike this deck. I don't like the playstyle. It has the restriction like the Monarch deck had, with no use of the extra deck to go into. This deck just really wasn't my playstyle. Focusing on that lockdown playstyle is just not something I enjoy in a good variety of Yu-Gi-Oh decks. And the same applies for my pick for the number 6 spot, being True Draco. Or True Jacko, whatever you want to call it. Now, for number 5, this is actually one of the first decks that I own, still have the deck, and that is Infernity. Now, I really tried to like playing Infernity. I mix around some of the staples here and there from the Infernity deck. I just couldn't, get into the playstyle. With me being a Yu-Gi-Oh player, I like to have a hand to rely on. Now, you can see I had some extra spots here because I have the additional Infernity launchers with this deck as well. But for Infernity, having no hand and relying fully on your field, it just makes me uncomfortable as a Yu-Gi-Oh player. I like to have cards in my hand to be able to rely on with this deck, and just for the fact that you have no cards in the hand is just not a play style that I could go into. And more or less the use of 0 cards in our hand, the Archfiend plays, I really tried to use this deck, even just in fun aspects. I tried to go for a pure Infernity build. I tried to mix in all the different cards to use in the deck, Void Apocalypse, Tour Guide, you name it. It was just so combo oriented on specific plays, and I really wasn't enjoying it when I tried out the deck. And once again, no hand for this setup. The consistent loop, I would see it happen every so often with the Necromancer and the Archfiend plays, but once that happened, and I just couldn't really see myself enjoying this deck to the extent. Now, once again, these are all just my opinions. There are some people that I'm sure Infernities might be their #1 pick, but once again, that same person just might not feel the same way as I do with Salamangreats or Naturia or, Gishkis being in my top favorite Yu-Gi-Oh decks, which definitely do check out that list as well for my 60,000 subscriber special. But before that, stay tuned for the rest of the video because we still got 4 more decks to go over, with that being my next #4 spot being Metaphys. Now, with this deck, there's a little more of a personal opinion with this deck revolving around Duel Links. Now, this one, I didn't really want to stick too many decks from Duel Links on this list on why I dislike the deck. Otherwise, there would have been other decks that I do enjoy in the actual Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG that I don't enjoy in Duel Links, and that being decks like, Dark Magician, obviously, Kawaki Meru. I just wanted to stick Metaphys in the #4 spot because whenever I went up against this deck in Duel Links, I didn't enjoy playing against it. There was the banish aspect of all the different monsters resolving in the standby phase of your opponent's turn and your own turn. You had to rely on the banish playstyle for the Metaphys monsters, which there are a bunch of other decks that I do enjoy banish playstyle, like Thunder Dragons. I really do like that setup that deck does in Duel Links of all places, but going up against the Metaphys deck and seeing it in Duel Links, a lot of times I would get inspiration in Duel Links for decks that I want to play. I just never got that with Metaphys. I really did not enjoy this deck, its overall concept. It hasn't really gotten much support lately either, so there wasn't really new building aspects to go off of for this deck. So with its old banish playstyle, there are just other decks that I find a lot more fun to be able to do so and enjoy my time when using those decks as well. So we're in the top 3 now, and I would say the next deck is the closest to the current meta that we have that I at least decided to put on this list because it's been long enough since the deck has seen any meta relevance, and still then, I don't like the deck. I don't have any chance to play the deck, and that deck is the Fluendaries deck. This deck is, once again, just like True Draco, Monarchs, a lockdown deck. Now, the card that, really did lock down your opponent is the Barrier Statue of Wind, which is still banned, but we still have other ways to restrict your opponent with this deck, and that is whether it be the Empen playstyle, stopping special summons, you name it, this deck just resolves normal summons, it gets around special summon plays, and every time I would go up against this deck against locals, it had to be a 1-card answer to get rid of it. You can either stop the Rabina play with Ash Blossom, Imperm, you name it, they'd have the Fluendaries and Adventure. If you did go for the Imperm play, you really only had to focus on the Ash Blossom to stop this deck, and then once you stopped the deck from moving, that was a big way just to shut down the deck as a whole. I didn't enjoy playing against it. You really only had a couple answers to go up against it. If you opened up the right side, you could stop the deck. Just not for me with that play style. There are plenty of other meta relevant decks that I would go up against at locals and figure, I could see myself playing this. I could see myself giving Branded a try and seeing it and enjoying the play style, but I just couldn't get that with Fluendaries at the time when both of those decks were up in relevancy for the power of the decks as a whole. Now, for the #2 spot, we have another deck. This is the second and final of the decks that I actually own, and that is Altergeist. Now, I own this deck just because this deck has gotten some updates throughout the different Yu-Gi-Oh sets. I do like to update decks if people request them. That is why I have Altergeists. I never have really played this deck. I've done some practice games with it, but as a deck as a whole, I just don't enjoy it. It's a big trap-heavy play style. You have a couple combos to go off of for the Altergeist setup on the field, but really not any that I can fully be committed to as a type of deck to play. And I really do enjoy a good majority of the decks from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains series. The Altergeist deck just isn't one that I've enjoyed playing, and mostly just have to, keep relevant with any new support we get in the future for this deck. And that leads us to our number 1 spot, and that is the Zodiac deck. Now, this was a true powerhouse deck. I wouldn't say it's powerful at all anymore, but with this deck, being the fact that Dryden and Broad Bull are still limited in power on the ban list, this is just a deck that I don't see, I didn't even enjoy at the time. I was too worried for a good majority of decks that I would potentially put on this list being Xyz monsters. I would say Xyz is not one of my favorite, type of extra deck monsters to summon. Synchro, I definitely do enjoy, and Fusions on top of that. Xyz, not so much. I would say Xyz aren't some of my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh decks to be able to use. You can see that from my top 10 Yu-Gi-Oh deck lists, because I have cards like Lavels, Morphtronics, Naturia, all decks that focus on Synchro more than Xyz playstyle. And the Zodiac deck, being a one-card Xyz type of deck, is a cool concept, but just not one that I enjoyed playing against at the time. It was extremely broken at the time when I went up against it, and for the decks that I was using, there was just no good way to combat this deck. Now, like I said, it's a bias of, I guess you could say, saltiness playing against the deck, but even then, in those situations, if I have that option, there's always the chance that I'll want to try the deck and play it, and I just never had that desire when it came to Zodiacs. I've seen plenty of people enjoy this deck. I do think the card arts are cool for a good number of the cards, but just not one I could ever see myself playing. But that is the number 1 spot. And as I said, there are a good number of Yu-Gi-Oh decks that I really do enjoy playing. This list was definitely hard to come up with, because I would say for the majority, I do like a lot more Yu-Gi-Oh decks than I do dislike them. And I wanted to keep this as more or less just a list for decks that I've tried playing, my honest try for them. And either I just didn't enjoy the playstyle, I didn't like what the end gimmick was for the deck, and that's why I decided to put them on this top 10 list. When we hit 80,000 subscribers, I'll definitely have to think of something else for a top 10 list, because once again, this is a deck profile channel, and I want to focus more on that for the subscriber specials. And as always, until next time, don't forget to comment down below what your least favorite Yu-Gi-Oh decks are and why. And until next time, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and Kiratwig out.